Thank you for joining us today for the Pulitzer Center's ongoing Zoom series focused on justice. Our topic today is filmmaking and activism, in conversation with three really special filmmakers. And so as we wait for more folks to join us, please let us know in the chat where you're from. And we invite you to share, if you would like, whether you are a formerly incarcerated individual yourself, the family of affected individuals, or engaged yourself with the criminal justice system. It's safe to say that in the United States, just about every one of us is touched in some way by the history and fact of mass incarceration. I'm John Sawyer. I'm with the Pulitzer Center. We believe that it's critical, especially at this moment in our history, to keep issues of justice at the forefront of our reporting and our conversations. For those of you who have not joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization based in Washington, supporting more than 170 reporting projects each year on global and local issues. We've developed a strong university program that includes workshops and conversations with journalists and awards for reporting fellowships every year to students from our 35+ university partners. On the K-12 education front, we reach thousands of students and educators via class visits, online sessions, and professional development workshops. And we also organize public events, such as this one, and of course last month's first ever virtual performance of The Box, working with Sarah Short, Damian Brown, and the rest of that terrific cast. A few housekeeping matters before we start. Our aim is to incorporate audience questions as part of today's conversation. And as I'm sure many of you know from lots of Zoom experience the last few months, we'll do that through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So you want to begin adding your questions as soon as something comes to mind at any time during the conversation, and then we'll get to as many of them as we can. There's also a chat icon on the screen. And we'd appreciate it if you'd use the chat box now only for specific technology issues. Note that all attendees are muted other than the speakers, but if you cannot hear us, let us know via that chat box and we'll try to fix it. We want to let you know that we're recording this session to post it online for others who cannot join us today. If you'd like to tweet, I hope you will, please use the hashtag #JusticeFocus. And one final note, please remember to stay online once the conversation ends to learn about a related event coming up in the next couple of weeks, and also to participate in a brief survey. Now, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today. Catherine Gund, director of the just released film Aggie, on the life and work of her mother. Agnes Gund, the art collector and museum leader who a couple of years ago sold a prized Roy Lichtenstein painting and used the proceeds to establish the Art for Justice Fund initiative that has helped transform this country's debate on mass incarceration. I hope that many of you took advantage of your registration to this event for access to view Aggie. If you haven't seen it already, you can purchase tickets from the Film Forum to screen Aggie at home. And we've got a link to that on the site now. And in so doing, you'll be supporting one of the oldest independent theaters in the nation. Before bringing Kat on to discuss the film, we'd like to take a couple of minutes just to share the trailer from that film. And I think Holly's now setting that up, and hopefully we'll have it ready to view.
Yeah. What do you think of the movie? I think the movie is great. Which movie are you talking about?
Renowned philanthropist and art collector Aggie Gund stunned the art world when she sold Masterpiece by Roy Lichtenstein for $165 million in July and used the proceeds to start the Art for Justice Fund to combat mass incarceration.
We went to San Quentin. I had people come up to me and say, what in the world did you want to do that for? I think the case that struck me most was that of Eric Garner in that I Can't Breathe. I remember after he died, I just kept dreaming, I can't breathe.
Aggie understands that art makes it possible for us to have empathy, and that without empathy, there is no justice.
You have conjoined these two things, justice working through the arts.
I think of you as sort of the ultimate empath. You're somebody who really feels other people.
Oh, that's wonderful.
She laid bare wealth and privilege. Most people who have it pretend like they don't have it. And she said, I have this, and I want it to go to work. I want it to be so much bigger than one painting.
So I made questions today.
Why do you collect?
Have you ever cried in front of an artwork?
Do you want any of your grandchildren to be artists?
What is love?
Were you close with your mother?
Why aren't you a typical lady from Ohio?
How many of these conversations have you done?
What do you think you're going to do when you're grown up?
The giant question of life.
I heard you had sex with every artist that you collect. Is that true?
Wouldn't that have been fun?
So, Kat, thanks for this wonderful tribute to an extraordinary woman. Tell us about the approach you took to making the film, the challenges of telling a story so close to home, and what Aggie's story has to say to all of us about engaging directly to change the world.
Yeah, well, thank you for having us here today. It's great to be able to have this conversation. I appreciate the Pulitzer Center and our Art for Justice grantee partners, I think, are on the forefront, on the front lines of making all the difference in this move to end mass incarceration and the narrative change it's going to take to get us there. So I'm glad we're framing the conversation in terms of the stories that we tell. And I would never, ever, to answer your question, have made a movie about my own mother. And I don't recommend it, but what I set out to do really was to make a movie about art for justice. I thought that was a magical moment, a really unique, although I don't think it's a stretch. I think more people should be doing things like that, but it is unique, and it's something I wanted people to know about and people to emulate. And in order to tell that story, I felt I needed to unspool what were some of the milestones, what were the things that made her a person who would do that. How did she go from being born in a segregated, white, wealthy community in Cleveland, Ohio in the Midwest, into someone who has the politics and the beliefs and the values she has in New York City with, you know, a queer and multiracial family? What made her do that? And I think that's actually a question we can all ask ourselves. I frankly was asking it of myself the whole time I was making the movie as well. And I think we need to look at outside, beyond, past our sort of our identity markers, and to, you know, because I have 3 siblings, they were raised by the same parents in the same houses in the same cities and towns as I was, and we are very, very different people. And I think we do need to look at what brings us to a place where we feel we can invest in the wellness and safety and health of our own families, our communities, and our whole country.
Plus, you know, you had this amazing cast of characters involved. I mean, from Aggie's grandchildren to Glenn Ligon, Christo, Darren Walker, Anna DuVernay, Ellsworth Kelly, and some priceless scenes with John Waters. How did you manage such a wealth of material?
Well, it wasn't intended that way. In fact, I wasn't even intending to make a movie originally. I just wanted to do some interviews with her. She's notoriously camera shy. And so I don't have any footage of her. And so a few years ago, I asked her if I could just film 5 conversations, an hour each, just her and me, just do it. And we did one, and it was so bad. It was so boring, and we were both totally stiff and uninspired. And I said, you know what, let's not bother with these, but maybe I'll just film you with each of my kids. She has 12 grandchildren, but 4 of them are mine. And so each wrote up their own questions. I filmed them. I told them they could ask her anything they wanted. And who gets to do that? We don't even ask each other all the questions that we should be asking each other. You know, why do you think what you think? What do you imagine the future to look like? How are we going to get there? And so the kids all did that. And then I said, oh, well, that worked pretty well. And so she started listing some of her friends and colleagues and my friends and artists and different people we knew. And we had filmed about 10 of them before I finally turned to my producing partner, Tanya Selvaratnam, and who had been saying, you're making a movie, you're making a movie. I was like, I'm not making a movie. And then after about 10 of them, I said yes. And in the end, we did about 35. And to me, it really is the magic of the film. I don't think you could make a film about her any other way, because she doesn't want to look at the camera. She doesn't want to speak to the camera. She doesn't want to know there's a camera in the room. She really doesn't want to have a film made about her. So that was a central challenge for me, of how do you shine a light on someone and tell them they're great enough for the light to be shined on them. But part of why they're great is that they would never want a light shined on them. So I felt like the conversations between her and the other people ended up being really the reason I could put this into a film, because it ends up being more like a verite, like a direct cinema. You know, you're a fly on the wall. And so you ask about the community of people, and it really is her community. And there's something so extraordinary, you know, I don't realize it because it's, you know, her friends, my friends. I always think, even my kids are like, oh, you know, we don't know any celebrities. And I think, well, and out in the world, you know, Adnan's a celebrity and we know Adnan. You know, we have like, there are these, there are all these people, and it's really just her world. And I thought if we could show what her world felt like, that it might make it an attractive world for other people to aspire to.
Right. Well, before we turn to Adnan Khan and Emily Kassie, I just wanted to talk for a moment about the Art for Justice Fund work. And of course, the Pulitzer Center is among the dozens of Art for Justice grantees. Our work is on the journalism and outreach side, but many of those supported by Art for Justice are artists, advocates, frontline workers in the criminal justice reform movement. I hope everyone watching this will be inspired to Google Art for Justice just to see the extraordinary range of work that's happened just in the last couple of years. But if you could take just a moment from your perspective about this amazing community that Art for Justice has made possible, and some of the work that's being done that's particularly inspiring to you.
It's a wonderful question, and it has just grown and grown. In the beginning, it was just an idea. There was intention, which I think is part of what made it so magical, is Aggie's intention in this sale. It wasn't transactional. She wanted to figure out how to invest in imagination in order to end mass incarceration. And so it started with a few anchor grantees and some artists, and there was this idea that we were going to bring together artists and activists, artists and advocates. And even to the point where we started a sort of, you know, one kind of sub-granting section that was about uniting artists and activists. And I have to say that in making this movie, and over the course of the last, 6 months at least, really realizing that finally, what made us so different, and if people do check out the website, it is that that's our sweet spot. Like, other people aren't looking at artists and activists working together as being a way forward. But what I've realized now really is that all of the artists are activists and all of the activists are artists, and it's not so siloed, and people aren't separate, and bringing people together is just really bringing back around sensibilities and creativity and different people's ideas of what can be done and what they think they're good at and what they think they know. And if you combine those things, it's not really about it being an artist and an activist. I think if you're talking about filmmakers, look at, or even Pulitzer, obviously, it's like all of us are all of those things. And frankly, I would add philanthropy to that and say, we're all artists, we're all advocates and activists, and we're all philanthropists. And because we need to explode that definition so that people aren't intimidated by this idea that, she had $100 million painting to create this fund. Everyone has a way to contribute and a way to participate and a leadership that needs to be followed. And so that's, a very timely, to give one example would obviously be Desmond Meade and the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition in Florida, which, worked, and we worked with them early on and invested, a lot of resources to help Desmond's leadership get recognized. And what he did was he said, if you've served your time after being convicted of a felony and you come out and you're a returning citizen, you should be able to vote. And over 75% of people in Florida said that's absolutely right. There's no reason you shouldn't be able to vote after you come home from serving your time, regardless of what they thought about whether you should serve time or how long you should serve. People said that's a fundamental right. And the right wing, of course, slapped it back as hard as they could and said, you've got to do community service still, you've got to pay off all your fines and fees. And we were just like, oh my God. And Desmond said, that's not a problem. Excuse me, they can do community service with me, and then I can have them go out and get other formerly convicted people to register because we listen to each other. So this is actually a good thing. And I was like, you're the most creative thinker there is. And he just is undaunted. And it is what, why I bookend my movie, if people have seen it, is that it starts and ends with Ava DuVernay, who made The 13th, which inspired the creation of the Art for Justice Fund. It starts with her saying, I asked her what the relationship was between art and justice. And she said, they're the same thing. They're both about the imagination. They're about seeing something that's not there and then working to make it so. And to me, that's what the Art for Justice Fund is really about. And if we could get more people to that space where they have critical thinking, where they're able to make their own decisions, where they read and understand what's going on, they ask questions, and that they're provided with the basic fundamental needs that they have, then we will have a more just society.
But just one thought on that. You mentioned the role of philanthropy, and I think one of the many sort of genius elements of the Art for Justice Fund is the way Aggie brought in Darren Walker from the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Philanthropies Group, and sort of people that had amazing connections in foundation world, among philanthropists, and in terms of modeling the behavior, inspiring other people to do it, and then drawing on the resources of these large foundations. That was a huge, I think, part of the success that this has had so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really beautiful because her partner in this work is Darren Walker, who's the head of the Ford Foundation. And as he says in the film, so insightfully, just bracingly clear, he says, without art, there is no empathy. And without empathy, there is no justice. And he's so sort of committed to and consistent on trying to figure out how to get us from here to there. There's we were on a great conversation the other day about abolition, and it was after a conversation about where people feel they are in the continuum of abolition, or in the soup of where they would identify. And the question we posed ourselves this last week was really, how can we get there from actually where we are now? It's one thing, I consider myself an abolitionist. It's easy for me to say what that would look like. It's much more challenging for me to say, how do we actually go from this place where we have over 2 million people incarcerated, over 4 million people who are under supervision, on parole or on probation. That's 6 million people, over 6 million people. How are we actually going to create a society when we say defund the police and everybody freaks out, instead of acknowledging that in schools, the only support person they have is a cop? They don't have a nurse. They don't have a therapist. They don't have any of the people that help children thrive and grow and learn. They only have a police officer. That to me is like a no-brainer. But, so for Darren, to go back to the relationship to philanthropy, for Darren, Darren's the one who actually introduced Aggie to Adnan, and who brought her into San Quentin, and who understood that she knew that her change was not going to be charity. And as he says, some people give money because of generosity, and you're giving money because of justice. And that is very different. that people who are looking at the situation they're in, where they have more than they need and other people have not enough of what they need, to be able to look at that and say, to undo that, I will have to have less, is a very different situation than the people in traditional philanthropy who say, you should have more, but they never acknowledge that to get there, they're gonna have to have less. And I think that's been a beautiful synergy between Darren and Aggie.
So on that note, let me bring in Adnan Khan, the director of Restore Justice. As you said, that you and Aggie first met him at San Quentin. Adnan got his start as a filmmaker when he founded First Watch, a media filmmaking project produced entirely by incarcerated men while serving a sentence at San Quentin. And so before having a conversation with Adnan about that, and the rest of us, I'd like to share, we want to show a brief clip from First Watch to get a sense of what that work was like.
I feel like I'm a storyteller, man. I want to tell people stories. I want to tell mine, I want to tell others. There's like interesting people around here, interesting circumstances and experiences that people go through. And I think society gets, they get a variety of narratives, but I don't think they get a narrative from us. When we talk about incarcerated people, there's all sorts of TV shows and all sorts of stories and things people write and things people say, and how society shares information about incarcerated people with each other. It just builds like a pool of information that I think doesn't have all of the pieces to have a correct assessment of what incarceration or what incarcerated people are about. I really want society to give us a chance to show them what we see. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm not saying it's fair or biased or whatever it is, right? I'm just saying that, check this out, this is what we see. So come look.
Great. So Adnan is a leader on the advocacy side, working through Restore Justice to reduce long sentences for violent crime. I'm promoting a criminal justice system that prioritizes restoration and remediation over punishment. But I want to hear about that work. But first, can you tell us about how you got into filmmaking yourself? What were the obstacles that you had to overcome at San Quentin to tell the amazing stories that you've told?
Yeah, thank you, John. I appreciate the invitation to this amazing panel. It's very hard to explain to people who don't actually know how prisons work and how first of all, they're not uniformed. Every prison, every facility that I've been to has been different, how it's been administered, what's allowed, what's not allowed. But it took me I spent 16 years in prison. I was sentenced to 25 years to life at the age of 18. And about 12 years into my incarceration, I finally get to a place like San Quentin that offered some type of programs and some sort of rehabilitation classes. And one part of San Quentin, they had what they call the Media Center. And it sounds bigger than it was at that time, but a handful of us kind of somehow, some way evolved it, where I was able to go into this media center, learn a little bit about storytelling through audio, through print. And then I just saw the videos and the cameras in the back. And I just wanted to really, really highlight the video aspect of incarceration, because visuals are extremely, extremely important in my opinion. And it is actually the obscurity of prisons that allow these conditions to thrive inside. People have no idea what actually happens. It happens very subtly. The punishment isn't just physical abuse. The punishment comes systemically through deprivation, depriving you of love, depriving you of family, charging you for phone calls, charging you for food, charging you for all sorts of things, using you as slave labor. And so that is kept obscure. And because it's kept obscure, like I said, that is what allows the conditions to thrive. So when I got to the media center, I wanted to really uplift or somehow get approval of a video project. And skipping a lot of details and a lot of headaches and a lot of miracles, I guess, we were able to get an approval. We talk about philanthropy, not for money, but for justice. What Kat was saying, we had a donor who donated a bunch of money for us to buy brand new 4K equipment. And then here we are, we get the cameras in our hands, we get a computer, editing software, and then we're looking at each other like, wait, what do we do? Because when we first got locked up, a bunch of us were serving time since the 90s or the early 2000s. Technology changed. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, none of that existed when I was incarcerated in 2003 at 18 years old. So when we finally got a camera, and mind you, we don't have a professor, anyone teaching us film. We don't have YouTube, there's no internet access. So we literally learned how to to edit videos and shoot videos through reading books or watching TV. I remember we used to give each other homework and tell each other, like, count how long each clip lasts in commercials. And then what angles did they use? Was it a close-up? And why did they use the close-up? And so just using like our own creativity with the extremely limited resources, we wanted to use that to tell people who we are, that we're people inside. And I'll just close off this last question, your question, John, by saying that it's really a commentary on value, right? Like a lot of people say, oh, Kat and Aggie and Helena and Darren Walker came into San Quentin and we as incarcerated people were able to meet them. Well, they met us too, right? And so the value there and when we talk about equality, they also met us. We have value too, we may not have wealth, but we're enriched in other areas of our life, and so the video project is to hopefully change narratives, tell the truth, let us be the journalists instead of other people telling our story, and reclaim that narrative and increase our value all along.
Well, I think that speaks so much to the work you're doing with Restore Justice. And you know, to me, as a journalist looking at this, I think there's an issue here of media complicity, of narrative frames that tend to undermine instead of advance needed reform, so that, you know, we're all familiar with the media stories. It's just like, it's almost a cliche that focus on the inequity of long sentences for nonviolent crimes, for example. But when we frame stories that way, we leave the suggestion that there isn't anything wrong with sentences of life or decades for crimes of violence. And I think that's at the heart of what Restore Justice is trying to do. But tell us about that work, and also to the extent to which you see film and storytelling as part of your advocacy campaign.
Yeah, I think that when we create any type of distinction in who deserves mercy and who doesn't, I think we do a huge disservice and we guide justice in the wrong direction. I was sentenced to life at 18 years old. A lot of my friends and colleagues were sentenced to life as teenagers. And one thing I also always like to share to put things in perspective, it's the crime that happens, but we need to understand what happens before the crime and then what happens after. What happens 10 years, 15 years later after committing a violent act, even something such as murder, which is not excusable. And I think people misunderstand that when we talk about healing people, that we're talking about excusing people or being light on punishment. And I also want us to, it's really a self-reflective question. What is it about you as an individual that wants to harm someone, that wants to see someone punished and harmed for harming someone else? Like the death penalty, where we have the death penalty, we kill people to tell people killing people is wrong. It's just very counterintuitive, just that concept. So when we talk about what violence is, for me, I went from, by the time I was 17, I was a parentless, homeless, high school dropout, and extremely layers of trauma with that, layers of grief, addicted to marijuana, alcohol throughout my teens. So again, 17 years old, I was a parentless, homeless, high school dropout. Under those conditions, at the age of 18, I committed a crime. That's when the police showed up. What a police officer is and what they provide weren't safety. They came to arrest me. But what I needed before I harmed someone was not in the community. I literally didn't have a homeless shelter to go to. I didn't have proper schooling, education, a mentorship program, nothing. There wasn't anything there. Substance recovery services, none of that was there. So when media shows up in this and that intersectionality, media loves to focus on, first of all, media is a business, and it sells. Whatever sells, it's going to be, that's what's going to, things are going to be made more than likely in that realm. And so when media shows up, the fear and the crime, the whodunit mysteries, you know, a person will watch an hour show of Law and Order, and in this show, there's a person whose character has been literally created. So people were sitting at a desk probably and say, okay, what is this, the criminal? Okay, the criminal's black, has dreads. What kind of clothes they wear? Oh, baggy clothes. What kind of music does this criminal listen to? Oh, he listens to hip hop, you know, and this is how this person talks. And so a quote unquote criminal in these shows is actually created. And so ask yourself, why and where is that person created from? It does come from a systemic place. So media, again, has been historic in shifting the narrative towards punishment, all the way to the public display. Before there was even a printing press, the public display, people would be marched into the marketplace, given baggy clothes, weren't allowed to shave or have hair because they quite literally, people who committed harm looked like monsters to people, looked very barbaric to people. And then they would punish them and torture them in front of everyone in the marketplace. And then when you had the printing press, and then when you had wanted posters, you had the postcards of lynchings that were passed around and mailed throughout the country in history. Then you have mass incarceration and all the way until 2020, where we're still harming people through media narratives. So that's why it's very, very important to understand when we tell a story, to make sure we tell the entire story and not the story of the crime.
And that feeds into your advocacy work. I mean, the legislative reforms and others that you're seeking.
Quite directly, I think that if you ask yourself, what do you know about prisons and incarcerated people? Everybody here that's watching, what do you know about incarcerated people? And then what is your source of information? And then when you go vote for your elected official and their values, or your representative, your senator, or your state senator, or your state assembly member, or your governor, or your mayor, when you vote for these people and their values towards justice, advocacy, justice reform, punishment, where are you coming from? What is your source? Is it CSI Miami, CSI New York? Is it a movie? Do you know incarcerated people? Do you know formerly incarcerated people? Do you understand racial capitalism and abolition and systemic oppression and slavery, how and convict leasing, like these ideas? Do we truly understand these things to understand what a just society and a fair and equitable society today looks like? So our media narratives, John, is directly linked to our advocacy work through legislation and through narrative shaping in society, so we can have more people understand who people like myself are.
So on that note of humanizing people affected by incarceration, I want to bring in our third filmmaker, Emily Kassie of the Marshall Project. The Pulitzer Center supported her most recent project, Immigrants in the Pandemic, 2 stories of detention and survival. It follows the lives of individuals who are undocumented, homeless, and detained, and who are fighting to survive during the coronavirus pandemic. The stories she reported with Ben C. Solomon were featured earlier this fall on PBS Frontline and the Marshall Project. But before bringing Emily into the conversation and apologizing for the ambulance in the background, we'd like to show a short clip from one of the Frontline reports.
Lo difícil de que mi papá no está porque los niños han estado muy tristes.
Estoy cansada.
¿Estás cansada? Tratar de controlarlos un poco y que ellas no caiga todo el estrés sobre ella. Aunque eso sea que el estrés se me pase a mí.
Andrea sufre de depresión. Lo que más le afectaba era mi mamá pasar por un momento difícil porque ella no estaba acostumbrada a ver a mi mamá tan triste. Bueno, la pandemia llegó, fue lo último que faltaba para hacer las cosas mucho más difíciles.
Pórtate bien con tu madre. Ok. Te quiero. Te quiero mucho.
¿Ya tu mujer? Espere que Andrea va a hablar con usted.
¿Cómo estás?
Pues ahí más o menos. Preparándonos para volar. Preparándonos para irnos de vuelta. Para viajar. Solo viajando pasamos nosotros. ¿Cómo estás, Jesús?
Aquí, preocupado, medio enfermo.
Pero ¿desde cuándo usted se siente mal con ese malestar que me dijo en la mañana de la gripe, la tos y el dolor en el cuerpo? ¿Desde cuándo?
Varios días ya, lo que pasa es que todavía no me daba recuerdo, ¿me entiendes? Porque si no me da recuerdo, de todos modos lo que estaba aquí cada 15 días. Entonces yo mejor
New data suggests a growing outbreak of coronavirus infections among immigrants in U.S. custody.
So far, the government has refused to consider a large-scale release of detainees.
Mi esposo dice que están asustados en este momento porque como que dijeron que unas de las celdas de abajo ya habían contagiados. Me preocupa que llegue a pasarle a él ahí, porque encerrados. De igual manera, también me preocupa que Dios no lo quiera me vaya a infectar yo. Porque mis hijos no tienen a quién arrimarse.
It's an amazing story that Emily and her colleagues told, and I hope you can find it on the Marshall Project site, on our site. So if you haven't seen the whole thing, I hope you'll watch it. Emily, you and the Marshall Project approach these issues as journalists, not advocates, and yet you're bringing to light abuses and suffering that cry out for policy response. How do you see your role in these types of stories?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me, John. And it's so great to be here with both Catherine and Adnan and hear their perspectives and stories as artists and as advocates. So our role is, to try to present a balanced picture as close to the truth as possible of what's happening to vulnerable populations. And at the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit newsroom, we have the privilege of not being pushed by any sort of, ad content that we need to get certain clicks for, or any sort of profit-driven work. And so that allows us to really dig into these really important topics and do them with a lot of input and resources from the whole newsroom. And so during the pandemic, we saw our role as documenting what was happening both in prisons and detention centers and jails, and to the loved ones of those folks all over the country, because we all know how hard it's been to deal with the pandemic and how it's affected all of our lives individually. Now imagine, your husband is locked away. You are an undocumented immigrant, you have 5 children, you don't have a home, and your mother-in-law, who was letting you sleep on the floor with your children, just got infected with the coronavirus, right? And you have nowhere to go. You can't get a job because you're undocumented. You're scared to go to a hospital just in case they turn you in. And that's the situation for Norma, the woman you just saw in that clip. And so our role is to try to bring Norma's story and people like Norma to as wide an audience as possible, as well as documenting the data and keeping track of how many people are being infected and what the policies are and how they're being treated. And so our role is not necessarily to advocate for specific policy. However, we are mission driven, which is that we know there is a problem with these 2 gigantic systems, immigration and incarceration in America, and our job and role is to shine a light on as many broken parts of the system as possible. And as you said, humanize the very real and very human people who are caught up within them and allow people to really connect with them. And I think that was our role with Norma. And what was so nice about that story and about what Frontline let us do with that story was that you weren't hearing necessarily any sort of narration from a journalist perspective. You were really living through Norma's experience day in and day out.
Right. Just to imagine how terrifying it is, that comes through, where your lifeline is the call to Jesus, and not knowing how he's doing, hearing about that he might be getting sick, and you know what his status is, what their status is, and from his point of view, being in detention, unable to do anything to help them on the outside. You just get the sense of paralysis for all of them involved in that. I think your point about the not having to play to clicks is so important, and in terms of, and this goes back to what Adnan I think was saying about the media's role in general, and in a way selling a product, and that's one of the great joys of the Pulitzer Center, like the Marshall Project, is that we don't have one of those big clickers at the top of the newsroom that tells you exactly how many people are clicking on every story. It's not a factor in what we decide to support or to engage in. We engage in the issues that we think aren't being talked about, and we try to raise money wherever we can to make them possible. And we try to promote interest and engagement through events like this, or through the classroom work that we do, or the work with universities. And you can kind of build a community up from the ground up that doesn't require on kind of least common denominator of hitting people with extremes and almost caricatures. But I don't know how, I'd be interested in, Kat, your thoughts, Adnan's, all three of you, on how do we change the kind of meta narrative for the media, the commercial media at large, which is playing to all of that, and how do we get out of that structure?
Well, I can jump in just from the news perspective. I think we've actually seen a lot of growth in a positive direction. I mean, there's a ton of work still to do, but 5 years ago, or even 6 years ago when the Marshall Project started, these issues weren't top of the A1 on the New York Times necessarily. Like the issues around criminal justice and immigration weren't bipartisan issues. Not that they are completely bipartisan now, but these two big issues are the center of the presidential debates and, the election, and we're all thinking about these things now in a way that they weren't. And so that's a step forward in my mind, at least, that this is now being addressed. And now I think, we look to those who, like Adnan, who have experienced what this is actually like, to look to what we can do from here now that people are paying attention.
I mean, I would just say, building off that idea that things have changed, I think that the narrative change is what leads journalism and policy and everything else. And that, the bipartisan, there's a lot of people that have been working on these issues for a long, long time. There was a real sort of stars aligning for how it became bipartisan, and the number of people coming home, leading to there being so many formerly incarcerated people who are working and doing activism and doing art and doing journalism and doing everything. That has to have something to do with the narrative change. Color of Change putting pressure on the cop shows was not a tiny thing. That was a huge thing. And an example that I was talking to Emily about earlier is one of our grantee partners, called In Plain Sight, and it's a group of people, a collective, but there was this skywriting series of phrases that were written over detention centers that really drew people's attentions in Spanish and English, said, we see you, said all kinds of different things that phrases that artists had come up with in order to draw attention to what was happening in there. And I think we have to change the stories, and Marshall Project is doing so much of that too, in getting in front of it and not doing a traditional kind of storytelling. It even happened, very clearly with the way marijuana was represented in the media, right? So the media always has people in hoods and in dark alleys and whatever. And then all of a sudden, when the lights were on and lots of different white people talking about medical care and whatever, it changes how people see it. And then suddenly, you don't have the same fight when it comes time to change the law. So I think I wouldn't put any one of these narrative change elements above the other. I think they all work really closely together.
I think that, when I first was incarcerated in 2003, I mean, we looked at the 90s and 80s and 90s of tough on crime and all the stuff that was happening with media. There was groundwork that was laid from those people who are upholding these racist and systemic systems for media to continue writing stories about that, right? So like you would hear about felons, inmates, convicts. You would hear that language very consistently. I mean, you hear it today too, but it was public opinion and what most people thought that was driving a lot of articles. So I do question myself, like the groundwork, would Marshall Project, for example, exist when I was first incarcerated? Would there be a place for that? The groundwork that was done through advocacy and formerly incarcerated people and philanthropy and all in the last decade, at least starting in 2010, for me, when I started noticing a little bit of hint of change while I was still serving my life sentence, it was just a lot of people. It was family members who came together. It was advocates, activists. It was a lot of people who laid the groundwork, and it took time. It took 3-4 decades for some people who've been doing this for a long time, quite literally generations. Black Panthers, and we can go further back, that allowed this place to exist. Now we're in a space where you see it being more common. You see mass incarceration, these buzzwords being much, much more common, and more people, especially in the past 6-7 months since George Floyd's murder, that you see the approval of such stories now, which is great. We want to hone in on that. But it makes me think that the advocacy is, I think, that really, really drives public opinion. We need to be out there more and more, and it's supported by journalism and media. I will also say, like, if you were to create a show, for example, way back when about police brutality in the 90s after Rodney King, like how many people would consume that? And I think it was a missed opportunity, possibly could have been a missed opportunity back then, but it didn't. Instead, there was more cop shows and more Law and Order shows and more CSI whatever shows. So yeah, I think there's a time now that I do feel like you could be non-biased in journalism, but I think we're in a very different time in our country, in our world, that I'm not sure what non-bias means anymore. Can you be non-biased? Is it just reporting facts? What are the facts? So many facts have been reported based on police officer testimony or police officers' credibility as truth. So what are facts? And we need to revisit all of that again.
I have to jump in and just say a very funny thing that one of my kids said the other night, because we were watching CNN and he was on the phone with another friend of his, and the friend said something, he was like teasing me, he goes, that's because CNN is left-leaning. And my son said, the facts are left-leaning, truth is left-leaning. And it was just like exactly that, and I've been catching some of the questions in the chat box, but that same question, how do I get, or how do any of us get our kind of material seen by somebody who is normally watching Fox News? And how would they actually learn it? I mean, there are people who watch edited versions of Trump talking and they think he's totally against white supremacy and, doing everything he can to fight COVID. Like, you can turn these things. It's really like, how do we use this notion of objectivity or truth or facts in this day?
At the margins, at least, in the case of President Trump, where the prison sentencing reform, that's one of the really rare instances where there was some movement from the Republican side, and largely, I think, due to Jared Kushner and the fact that his father had been in prison, so that he knew the system, he knew what it was like. And because of that anomalous circumstance, you were able to find a bit of common ground. There's a long way to go, but at least there was an opportunity there.
It did,
or it could have been a political opportunity. It could have been that the Democrats have a strong hold on criminal justice reform, and maybe this is a political strategy. And when you look at the First Step Act and really break that down, who it affects, who.
You're frozen, Adnan, but the First Step Act does only affect federal prisons, and that's a tiny amount of incarcerated people. Go ahead, Adnan, you're back. You were frozen.
I was actually going to say just that. 90% of people are in state prisons, so mass incarceration is actually a state issue, not a federal issue. And so I really feel like that. I don't know. There's a lot I can say there, but even as someone who comes from privilege and then gets incarcerated, it's such a different experience. Now, white incarceration is much different from Black incarceration. I have not experienced incarceration in a Black body, right? And I had, to use a very loose term, privilege in my incarceration, even though I can talk about the abuses, right? But I did not experience it in a Black body with white correctional officers. It's a much different. And how privileged people get treated in prison. Sure, it's still prison, it's abusive, it's whatever, but there is privilege within the prison system as well for people who come from privilege. So I probably wouldn't associate that with Jared Kushner's father, me personally.
No, he did, but I do think that if there was any evidence that they were serious about it, they would be looking at prosecutors, they would be looking at police, they would be looking at things that were going to actually change the system and not just make sure that them and their friends could get out of the federal system when they get finally.
I think a lot of two thoughts. One is that a lot of what has become mainstream, even for liberals, not just for conservatives, it is political. I think that's been the nature of this country. I mean, you look at the issue of immigration, immigrant detention was created over the last 40 years by both, Democrats and Republicans. You have Bill Clinton creating some of the harshest immigration laws and detention laws in the history of the country. So I think that these trade-offs are always political. And there's not this kind of inherent, good in progress to, all Democrats and liberal, ideals, that this has been a back and forth of, what gets me elected and what is appealing to an audience, and, the work to get towards that. And to clarify, that comes from pressure from the public, it comes from pressure from the media, and that's, from my perspective, how things are pushed forward. And then to this other question about truth, I don't think that there is no longer a truth or a dissolution of truth. I think truth has always been our best attempt to get a fair picture of what's happening. And I don't think that has changed. What I think has changed is that we are overrun by information that is not all, equal. And it's not all vetted, and it doesn't all have the same sorts of structures and institutions vetting them. And, there's never been a time where the media has always been completely, flawless or truthful. What happened is that we had a whole lot less of it. And so we trusted it more. We had, the Walter Cronkites, and we had these people speaking to the nation and telling them what is. And, we didn't have access to a constant stream on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram telling us from other perspectives what might be happening. And so I think what I hope, and as a journalist, is to, in the next however many years, is to try to restore trust in good journalism that is focused on the facts and is transparent to an audience about how they're finding those facts. Because I think the more we can be open about our methodologies of how we're counting COVID cases in prison, for example, which the Marshall Project has done a great piece on, why we have the structures we have, and showing kind of how those policies were built over time and who's doing what now. I think those are the ways to rectify that chasm between the population and the media. But I don't think that the essence of near truth, or what we can find as truth in a society, has.
You're breaking up a little bit for a moment, Emily, but I hear your point. I think that the notion of kind of acknowledgement of mutual common complicity in a lot of these issues, and moving it beyond the exact political moment we're in, sort of acknowledging the role of both parties, lots of different interest groups across the country, and perpetuating the system that we have, is a step toward beginning to reform it. And I think, Adnan, to your point about white privilege and the first step, the very minor steps that it took, I think there is something to sort of the bringing an experience, even if it's a much circumscribed experience of a white privileged person. I'm thinking about the work that we did with Sarah Short on solitary confinement, the Box project, really extraordinary online production that we facilitated this fall with a number of people who were themselves veterans of having been in solitary confinement in prison. Sarah is a journalist who, her experience in this came from being arrested in Iran several years ago and serving nearly a year or so in solitary confinement in Iran. Totally different situation from the United States, but it was a common experience of being in solitary. And I think that informed deeply her approach and her empathy to the characters, the people that she met who had lived the system inside our prisons, and to conceive of the story, to tell it. And this is really what Art for Justice, I think, is about, and so much of the work that all of us, I think, are engaged in, is that notion of bringing those stories to light. And maybe just to kind of, we're running short of time, but maybe if each of you could just sort of do a kind of summation, summing up of what you would like to leave our audience with. We've covered a lot of ground here. The most important work that you see going forward, your next challenges that you're facing, what you'd like to see all of us focus on in terms of addressing these issues. I mean, Emily, you want to start?
Sure. So the question being, where do we go from here, sort of thing? Oh, God. Well, I think that we can do a whole lot more listening. I think that's something that we're all learning in this moment of, protest and police shootings across the country. I think a lot of people are waking up again, even 6 years after Ferguson. People are like, oh, this is still a problem. I think like the more listening that we can do to folks who have experienced this, people like Adnan, or through the films, that Catherine made, or the films we're making, or other outlets that are bringing characters and people who don't often get a voice to light, is one way to educate yourself. And I think education is a huge step to media literacy, understanding what you should be voting for, who you should be voting for. So to me, that literacy and expanding the knowledge base would be my hope for people in the next few years to come.
Adnan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we can definitely substantially increase is impacted people as journalists. People who are impacted, like you said, spent time in solitary. Let that person write about solitary. And if it's about qualification, then we should invest in those qualifications, right? School, classes, whatever it takes, film, enhanced writing, something we were doing on our own with limited resources inside, because we were really, really starving and hungry to put our own narratives out there. Because we won't use certain language, right? I won't use the word prisoner. I won't use the word inmate, convict, felon. I don't use those words because I was told those words, and those words have associations and treatment comes with those words. Also, the word prisoner, the reason I personally don't use it, it was written on my pants and my shirt for 16 years. So just the sight of it when I read it is repulsive to me. So I wouldn't use that. And I would use humanizing language because I'm coming from me seeking humanization. So I would say invest in incarcerated artists, formerly incarcerated artists, formerly incarcerated journalists, filmmakers, and writers.
And Adnan, if I could just jump in here and make a quick plug. The Marshall Project has a Life Inside series. This series we publish every single Friday. It's commissioned writers from inside prisons across the country. And it's all of their work, it's commissioned work. I think we're having a phone call coming in.
I'm so sorry. I always turn it off. I didn't. Sorry, Emily, go ahead.
That's okay. But we do have this fantastic series that has voices from inside every single week. And so it's so important to hear from those writers. And we also, and I forgot to plug this, have this initiative with Sundance where we've commissioned 5 filmmakers who are formerly incarcerated or justice impacted, who are making films about criminal justice. Please look out for these films and these filmmakers because they're unbelievable artists, and they've also had this experience that informs the way they see the world. So we'd love to do more of that, and we hope you'll tune in for those films as well.
Pay them too, I would say, for everybody who's listening. Make sure you pay. And when you talk about value and worth, let's not just use people. Let's make sure we utilize people and value their time and their expertise. So let's pay incarcerated people and formerly incarcerated people the way you would pay any journalist.
Kat, final words.
That's an excellent point. And I keep glancing at some of the questions, and I think my last statement might answer a couple of them, or at least allude to them. And one is, is there any reason you would use the death sentence? And I think that, Adnan and I could talk a lot. I mean, Adnan, obviously, about restorative justice. And the answer to that question for me is also the answer to the question of how has art for justice changed during COVID and quarantine and during the uprisings. And it was a relief, but also good to learn that we didn't have to pivot at all. We were already doing the future seeking positive work that is now being both revealed and exacerbated in this crisis and in the current moment, all of the crises together. And that all we've done is double down. We've actually, we're a spend down. We're giving all our money away in 5 years. So many people and now artists have been also giving money to the fund. Everything that comes in goes out. So we have a 6th year of $20 million. We've been taking a little bit from the 6th year just to give more now because people need it more, but also there's so much potential right now amidst all this horror. And that's where I think the restorative justice work needs to be amplified, because we need people to start thinking not in terms of who would you put to death, but in terms of how would you make a safe community and who is being harmed. The people inside have all been harmed before they went inside. And how do we look at what is going to make a healthy community, a healthy family? And we can take some of the lessons and some of the adaptations that we're coming to right now and keep them afterwards when we do get past COVID and when we do get past taking children away from their parents at the border, and when we do get past all of the legacy of slavery that Adnan laid out, we are going to be able to move past that, but we have to do it in a restorative way that is about reparations and restoration.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway to me is the urgency and the opportunity of the moment. We really are in an extraordinary time where lots of things are suddenly possible that we never thought were possible, or that we kind of taken for granted for decades and longer. So I think it is a moment for all of us, journalists, advocates, artists, to engage every way we can to bring the American people into that conversation. We're so thankful to all of you, to Kat Gunn and Adnan Khan and Emily Kassie for being with us. I want to thank the audience. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, and we'll aim to answer more of them when we post the video on pulitzercenter.org in the coming days. I want you to be sure to look at this link to Film Forum that we're putting on the screen. If you have not seen Aggie, or if you've seen it, this is how you can share it with your friends, the film, which is amazing, at the Film Forum. So do look that up. I want to thank my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Holly Peipenberg, our producer for this session. We want to thank our donors, and most especially tonight, the Art for Justice Fund, which has supported our Focus on Justice series and our reporting and education outreach on mass incarceration and related criminal justice issues. We really appreciate all of you for joining us today. For those of you who are able, please do support our mission with any level of contribution. Remember that we're a nonprofit journalism organization, and so we depend on donors to carry on our work. And we hope that you'll, if you haven't already, we hope that you'll sign up for our newsletter. It's once a week, easy way to keep up with all of the events and the journalism that we're producing. I hope lastly that you'll join us for our next Talks at Pulitzer. Fascinating series Tuesday, October 20th and Thursday, October 22nd on the extreme weather events that are becoming the norm across the American Southeast. This draws on the work that we've been doing with dozens of journalists in our Connected Coastlines initiative. And for details on both of those, you'll find them at the pulitzercenter.org site. If you can, stay with us for a few moments longer. We'll take a brief survey after we officially close today's session. It helps us do better in the sessions to come, and we appreciate any recommendations and advice you might have for us. So with that, I want to thank you again, all of you, for being with us today, and hope that you'll join us again soon.
Thank you, John.
Thank you all.